an architecture media podcast, supported by the Australian Institute of Architects, produced on Boonwurrung country.
Welcome to Design Speaks Weekly, a podcast that explores the biggest stories in Australian architecture and design. I'm your host, Georgia Burks, and today I'm joined by architects Lawrence Nield and Philip Thalis. 25 years on from the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games, they reflect on their experience working on the Games masterplan, offering timely insights ahead of Brisbane 2032. But first, here's the latest news headlines from Architecture AU.
In the news this week, a new viewing platform inspired by the shape of a whale has opened at the Lockhart Gorge Blowhole on Victoria's Great Ocean Road. Designed by Denton Corker Marshall, the lookout is the final project to be completed under the first stage of the Shipwreck Coast Master Plan. Also making headlines, designs have been unveiled for a $150 million revitalisation of the Cadbury Chocolate Factory site in Hobart. Tasmanian architecture firm Cumulus, together with Art Processes, has shaped the creative direction of the project, which is set to open in 2027. And finally, a major 7-building mixed-use development designed by Stewart Architecture has been proposed for the Dixon Tradies site in Canberra's inner north. The site is currently occupied by the Canberra Tradesmen's Union Club, which will remain there but will relocate to a new building on site. Those are the headlines for this week. For the full stories and more news, visit architectureau.com. I'm Adair Winder. It's Tuesday, September 16.
This week marks the 25th anniversary of the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games. To prepare Sydney for this global spectacle, a team of built environment professionals came together to deliver an ambitious master plan. Among them were architects Lawrence Nield and Philip Thalis. Lawrence Nield was a founding principal and director of BVN and was the recipient of the 2012 Australian Institute of Architects Gold Medal. Lawrence has been involved in the delivery of projects for the Sydney 2000, Beijing 2008 and London 2012 Olympic Games. Philip Thalis is a founding principal of Hill Thalis Architecture and Urban Projects. He is a former councillor of the City of Sydney and the recipient of the 2024 Australian Institute of Architects Gold Medal. In today's episode, Lawrence and Philip speak to the opportunities for city making propelled by the Olympics. They reflect on design considerations that are necessary for a successful Games and critique how the profession can contribute meaningfully to the urban planning of the 2032 Brisbane Olympic Games. Hello, Philip and Lawrence, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi.
Lawrence, in 1994, you were appointed Head of Master Planning for the 2000 Sydney Olympic Games. Can you take us back to this time? What was the political context, and how did the Australian design industry feel towards the Games? Were they excited and optimistic?
Yes, I think we were optimistic, but let me just go back over the timing. I became the Professor of Architecture in Sydney in 1992, and I think because I was the Professor of Architecture, they asked me to join the bid that originally had been put together by the Greiner government, and then the Fay government asked me to join in the bid that was to occur in Monte Carlo in 1993, September 1993. So I worked on the bid and was part of the technical committee in September 1993. And when we won it, I suggested that we have an ideas competition, a design ideas competition, international one, which we asked a number of international architects as well as distinguished local architects. And for instance, John Neville was part of the competition, and the competition was useful. Not that it gave us good analysis of the site, but it showed the government just what a huge task they were in for, and realising that you're dealing with a site that sometimes has 300,000 people on it. So it was both useful in bringing up and getting ideas from many architects, and it was also even more useful for the government. And after the competition in the beginning of '94, the government then appointed me, which was in the form of the Homebush Bay Development Corporation, it was called, appointed me to get a team together and to lead the design for the planning at Homebush. And I think we got, it's interesting, these big infrastructure ideas initially people are very supportive of, and this was very supported by the press and also by the profession. But as things go on, people begin to have other ideas and begin to pick at it, particularly the press. Everything's going over cost, etc., which we didn't go over cost at all in Sydney.
And was the government at the time on board of the competition that you were suggesting?
Yeah, the government, which by that time was the Fay government, which was succeeded in the end of '94 by the Carr government, and most of the work was done during 1994. And that group that I got together had Philip on it and Ken Marr and Alex Popoff. And actually, when I was appointed, stepped down as being the professor in Sydney because of all the work I had to do in the Olympics, and worked from it's called in the Northern Territory a donga, a temporary building in Homebush.
Fantastic. And actually, that leads me to my question for Philip, which I'm curious to hear about. Philip, in 1992, your studio, Hill Thalis, won the national competition for the Sydney Olympic Village at Homebush Bay. Can you reflect on this project and how it led to you and Lawrence working together?
Thanks, Georgia. So we jointly won that. It's worth saying. We actually set up our practice at that time, but we collaborated. It was a national ideas competition. It wasn't an ideas competition, it was an actual competition. There were 5 winners out of 102 because the jury didn't decide they were going to have a second stage, and instead we decided to collaborate on the scheme. And that scheme became the genesis of the Green Games bid, which was instrumental in Sydney pipping Beijing when the decision was made in 1993 in Monte Carlo, wasn't it, Lawrence?
That's absolutely right, yes. The Chinese thought they'd won but didn't.
But the government didn't follow through on the promise of the village. And so it's a long story. We were excluded anyway until Lawrence got me and others involved in first the charrette, the ideas competition, and then the master plan itself.
There was already plans that were current, which were used in the bid, which weren't in many ways meeting all the requirements. And so the beauty of getting this together and these people is that we could really get a new plan then, and a plan that actually worked. And the simple way I explain that is we always aim to try and have a piece of city and not a sporting park. Sporting parks around the world have died after Olympic Games. Games that are integrated with the city have kept going and have thrived.
And that's sort of in reference to they've established a legacy that was part of the master plan. Is that correct?
Yes, legacy. What happens after the game, which is curiously called legacy, is in a sense, for as far as the city is concerned, the most important part of the Olympic Games.
And what could you reflect on what Sydney's legacy was or what they were planning to do?
Well, Homebush had 3 brick pits, of which 2 were filled up with absolutely commercial and toxic and domestic waste. So the bay was full of Agent Orange. It was really a dreadful collection of all sorts of dump things that started after the abattoir stopped in the 1970s, and then it became a landfill place. And re-establishing this scarred piece of cityscape was incredibly important. 100 million was spent on just remediating the site. So it brought back land right in the very centre of Sydney, in the geographic centre of Sydney, into what has now become a city with about more than 10,000 people living there now.
Lawrence and Philip, I think you could both answer this next question that I have for you, given your history of working together on the Olympics. And Philip, I'll start with you here. What was the biggest hurdle and biggest success of the Sydney 2000 Olympics? And what advice would you give built environment professionals working on Brisbane 2032 Olympics?
Well, the great opportunity at Homebush, as Lauren said, was more than 800 hectares of publicly owned land, much of it degraded, but it was at the geographic heart. And so I remember going, I think with you, Lawrence, to the Department of Transport to see whether we could get a through rail line. There had been rail infrastructure there to bring the cattle to the abattoirs. And I remember this meeting vividly. They said, oh no, we've got no plans. And so in the end, what we did was repurpose the existing rail lines to make a loop, because when we could at least get 30 trains an hour, we had to move, as Lawrence said, 300,000 people in a day because of the concentration of venues. I think when you talk about legacy, you really need to talk about increasing the capability for city making. This is the challenge for Brisbane. This is where Sydney could have done much better by concentrating everything together and by not integrating it transport centres as part of a greater city. I think that's a huge lost opportunity. The great thing is the metropolitan parkland in the heart of the city. And, of course, now they are putting it through metro through, and they're putting it through light rail through. We had that light rail plan in our 1992 Olympic Village scheme.
Yeah,
So
going all the way to Parramatta, yeah.
I think the thing is the anticipatory potential that you have in thinking about the city at the metropolitan scale, and this is what Brisbane really lacks when you look at the structure of Brisbane. And if that's not the number one agenda, then there's a fatal error.
Given everything that was thrown at us, I think as I walk through Homebush today, particularly down Murray Rose Drive and Australia Avenue, we see a city still not in any way finished, but beginning to move there. And more and more people are living there, and the transport will improve with, as Philip has just said. That was key. Interestingly, the loop we put in, I negotiated with the railways. The loop was put in on the only government land that was available. All the middle of that loop was owned by Lend-Lease, and Lend-Lease wouldn't have the train on their land, so we had to loop round Lend-Lease and bring the train right into the centre. It worked out very well, right into the centre, and the appropriate distance. You see, with huge crowds, you can't have the train going right into the stadium. You need to have at least 300 metres away so they can queue to get in the train and the thing. So the station was put in the very best place on the site, and even more interestingly, designed by Hassels and Ken Marr and others, was a beautiful station. So the station became a very important part of the thing. Let me just give you one story. When I was at the Olympic Games, and I went out, obviously everyone went out by train, and the train didn't charge. And this was after one of the days, we all got back on the train, and we're all sitting upstairs, and everyone started singing Advance Australia Fair. And they all got to the end of the first verse, and then everyone said, no one knows the second verse. And an old lady stood up and said, I know the second verse, and she sang to the whole of the carriage the second verse of Advance Australia Fair. So the railway is a very fundamental part of the development.
It's a public stage by the sounds of it, as well as a very important infrastructure. And I think, Brisbane's probably, in terms of the transport, it's going to be critical to 2032 Olympics. Philip, there are two kinds of Olympic cities, those that are planned properly for a long-term civic legacy, such as London 2012 and Paris 2024. And then there's those still working to catch up. Which path do you think Brisbane will take?
Well, that's a huge risk. I mean, you've got 7 years in Brisbane. That's what Sydney had. You've wasted a number of years already, going backwards, it seems, but you still have enough time. The biggest mistake you could have is to be contractor-led. You need to be thinking about city building first. You do have the advantage of having one metropolitan council in the state government. That should be a really productive partnership. How that's set up, Lawrence mentioned that at Homebush there was the Homebush Bay Delivery Authority. That was not fit for purpose and was replaced by the an overall Olympic committee, which you absolutely need. And you need intelligent design. It really needs to be design-led, not contractor-led. Contractors are very good at building things in the time. That's not the problem in Australia, even though there's only a limited number of them. The key thing people don't get properly is how to actually make the city better in the long term by using the investment. Paris has done it by limiting the investment. The model for Sydney was definitely Barcelona, which actually was the first city to use the Olympics for its urban improvement.
Lawrence, which pathway do you think Brisbane will take?
Well, looking at what they're proposing in Victoria Park, I think they're going in the wrong direction. I absolutely support what Philip said. Can I just say that in 2008, France and Paris asked me to join their bid for the Paris Olympic Games, and I worked in Paris for 3 or 4 months, and we didn't win. London won that. But we set out in that 2008 work that we would try and not have any new venues for Paris, or in fact one venue at the most. And in 2024, when Paris won the thing, they only had one new venue, or everything else was done in old venues or done in temporary structures. And that allowed things like having a stadium under the Eiffel Tower. It made a really spectacular and urban Olympics, and with only one, and it was $4 million cheaper than Rio in the total cost, and $4 million, or $3 or $4 million cheaper than Tokyo. And I suspect if we looked at it, it would probably be cheaper than London or Sydney.
It's fascinating to hear those numbers, isn't it? Philip and Lawrence, to end each episode, we ask our guests the same question. And Philip, I'll start with you here. At this moment in time, what is inspiring you?
I look like Lawrence. I've taught my whole career, and we just had the final studio last week, and we had 120 models out for public buildings and public space. And so, that optimism of talking to the young is a huge sort of shot in the arm for me. And, you've really got to then frame everything in the sense that what is possible. We're all aware of the problems of day-to-day practice, architecture, and in fact the global problems which just seem to be multiplying. But teaching in the young always is a source of optimism.
Hear to that, Philip. And Lawrence, what about you? What's inspiring you at this moment?
Well, what has inspired me over the last couple of years, and I was in Darwin last week, was that I sort of stepped out of the wonderful milieu in Sydney and went to work in Darwin for 5-6 years. And there we see a model of how cities may develop. That is, the heat where it never gets below 25 degrees in the evening, that I got a whole new take on urbanism in Darwin about how, unfortunately, with global warming, cities need to reconsider themselves in terms of greening, in terms of breezeways, and takes me back to Brisbane. I've got very interested in the overall microclimate of cities and how persuasive, how important it is. And Victoria Park is a key piece of greenery which the northeast winds coming into Brisbane use, and it brings much cooler air into the Brisbane CBD. As if that is now turned into a sporting park with lots of bitumen and paving, it will be a major blow for Brisbane.
All important things for the built environment professionals in Brisbane to think about as they proceed to the 2032 Olympic Games. Philip and Lawrence, it's been a pleasure talking to you both today. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks, Georgia. It's been fantastic.
Thanks, Georgia. Very important stuff.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode, which is supported by the Australian Institute of Architects. If you're interested in learning more about the built environment's contributions to the 2032 Olympics, come along to the Architecture Symposium All Eyes on Brisbane on Friday, 17th of October at the State Library of Queensland. For more information about this event, head to designspeaks.com.au. Be sure to subscribe, share, or leave a rating if you're enjoying this podcast. For more architecture and design stories, visit architectureau.com or sign up to one or more of our free newsletters. I'm Georgia Burks, and this has been Design Speaks Weekly. Design Speaks Weekly is produced on Boonwurrung country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture.